The crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, scattering light across the marble floor polished like a mirror. Glasses of champagne clinked, expensive perfumes mingled in the air, and the grand ballroom of the Kensington estate outside Atlanta pulsed with wealth and privilege. Politicians, business tycoons, and socialites in gowns and tailored suits floated through the room, speaking in measured tones about power, stocks, and influence. It was a world of money and glitter far removed from the streets where hunger gnawed in children. Like Amara Johnson went barefoot. Then, cutting through the polite laughter and string quartet, a voice thundered, cold and sharp, "If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you. But if you stumble even once, you go back to the shed. That's where you belong." The words hung in the air like a blade. The speaker was Howard Kensington, a real estate billionaire whose reputation for arrogance and cruelty was whispered about, even among his peers. His voice rang out like a gavel striking down judgment. The entire ballroom froze. Conversations died. Smiles faltered. All eyes turned toward the far edge of the room, where a little black girl in an oversized dress stood clutching a battered old radio. That girl was Amara. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few guests covered their mouths to stifle awkward laughter. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was some cruel jest or simply the grotesque entertainment of the powerful. Howard wasn't smiling. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, savoring the silence. Before he added with deliberate venom, "One misstep, and she goes back where she came from. Back with the rats. Back to the dirt." A wealthy woman in diamonds muttered under her breath, "This is appalling." But a man beside her chuckled, "That's Howard for you. Always needs a spectacle." Amara lowered her head. The borrowed dress hung loose at the seams, slipping off one thin shoulder. Her small feet were dusty, her toes curled against the cold marble. The cracked handle of the radio trembled in her grip, the only possession she had brought from the world outside these walls. At the far end of the ballroom, Samuel Johnson, her grandfather, stood stiff by the French doors. His knuckles whitened as his hands clenched. His chest heaved, fury and fear warring inside him. He wanted to run to her, to tear her away from this nightmare. But he also knew this was the only chance she might have at a life beyond poverty. His eyes begged her silently, "Don't accept. Don't do this." But Amara took a step forward, and another. The whispers in the ballroom swelled. Is she actually going to do it? She'll fall flat on her face. She doesn't even have shoes. Howard tilted his head like a predator amused by its prey. His voice dropped into a mocking drawl. "Well then, little mouse, do you accept?" Amara's chin lifted. Her small brown eyes locked with his. And though her voice trembled, her words cut clean through the room. "I'm not a mouse, and I'm not afraid of you." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some laughed nervously. Others looked away, unsettled by the defiance in the child's tone. Howard's mouth curved into something between a sneer and a smirk. He took a slow sip of scotch, then replied, "Bravery? From a weed? Don't fool yourself. Weeds don't belong in a garden of roses." Amara did not flinch. She straightened her shoulders, her voice steady now, strong. "Maybe I am a weed, but weeds grow where your roses die." The ballroom fell utterly silent for a moment. Even Howard's hands stilled on the rim of his glass. Guests glanced at one another, stunned. Never before had anyone, let alone a barefoot child, spoken to Howard Kensington that way. The old man chuckled at last, though there was no warmth in it. He set his glass down with a sharp clink. "We'll see about that," he said softly. All around, the glittering chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, throwing harsh light onto the polished floor. That now became a stage for cruelty disguised as challenge. Amara set the old radio down in the center of the ballroom. Her small fingers turned the worn dial until static gave way to a fragile, crackling melody, Strauss's Blue Danube. Distorted but still recognizable, she closed her eyes, drew a long breath, and steadied herself. Every guest in the room leaned forward, waiting for her to slip, to stumble, to fail. At the edge of the room, Samuel's lips moved soundlessly in prayer. His hands trembled. His heart pounded so violently it hurt. Howard folded his arms across his chest, his icy eyes fixed on the child who dared to defy him. The violins on the radio swelled. The music, fragile and imperfect, filled the cavernous ballroom. And there she stood, Amara Johnson, the barefoot granddaughter of a gardener, about to take her first step into a world that wanted nothing more than to see her fall. The first notes of the waltz sputtered out of the battered radio, warped by static, yet strangely haunting. The crowd leaned in, breath caught, waiting for the humiliation they were sure would come. Amara lifted her chin, eyes wide but unblinking. Her small chest rose and fell with a deep breath. Then, with a step that was more resolve than grace, she walked onto the marble floor. A murmur cut through the silence. She's actually going to try. Look at her, no shoes, no training. This will be over in seconds. At the head of the room, Howard Kensington tilted his glass, watching her like a lion about to toy with prey. His voice carried, heavy with mockery. So, you accept, little mouse? Amara stopped in the center of the ballroom. She turned her face toward him, her expression steady, her words sharp. I'm not a mouse. And you don't scare me. The words hung in the air like sparks. A few guests chuckled nervously. Others exchanged glances, uncertain whether to applaud or recoil. Howard's eyebrow lifted. He chuckled, the sound low and humorless. You've got spirit, but spirit doesn't change what you are. You're a weed, something that grows wild where it doesn't belong. Amara's lips curved into a faint smile, her voice ringing out clearly across the ballroom. Maybe I am a weed, but weeds grow where your roses die. The room froze. For a moment, even the air seemed to pause. Howard's smirk faltered, his fingers tightening around his glass. A ripple of whispers surged through the crowd. Did you hear that? She actually said it. She's braver than half the adults here. For the first time that evening, the balance of power shifted, if only by a fraction. The billionaire, accustomed to obedience and fear, found himself staring at a barefoot girl who refused to cower. Amara bent down, set the radio carefully on the marble, and clicked the knob again. The scratchy melody swelled. She placed her arms awkwardly in position, mimicking what little she had seen from afar, her bare toes flexing against the cold floor. But just as she prepared to take the first step, a voice broke through the crowd. She shouldn't have to dance alone. Gasps erupted. Heads turned. From the opposite end of the ballroom, a boy emerged from behind the crowd of adults. His blonde hair was neatly combed, his suit far too polished for his age. It was Ethan Walker, son of Senator Charles Walker, a man whose name carried weight in Washington. His mother shot up from her seat, hissing under her breath, "Ethan, come here this instant." But the boy ignored her. He walked toward Amara, his chin lifted high, his voice unshaken. "If she has to dance, I'll dance with her." The crowd broke into shocked murmurs. A senator's son standing beside a poor black girl against the will of his own family was an act that felt almost rebellious. Ethan reached her, extending his hand. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. "Are you sure you wanted to do this?" Amara hesitated. Her small fingers trembled. Her eyes darted toward Howard's icy stare. Then she whispered back, "I'm scared, but not of dancing. I'm scared of stopping." Ethan smiled faintly. "Good, then let's not stop." He took her hand. Together, they faced the music. The first turn was clumsy. Ethan stepped too wide, nearly tripping on the hem of his suit. Amara stumbled, her breath catching in panic. Laughter rippled at the edges of the room. But then Ethan squeezed her hand, steadying her. "Pretend we've done this before," he whispered. Amara let out a shaky laugh. "I've never danced in my life." "Neither have I," Ethan admitted. "So we'll fake it together." Something shifted in that moment. The two children moved again, still awkward, but this time with rhythm. Left, right, turn. The radio's distorted melody wrapped around them. They weren't elegant, but they were alive, barefoot and small, yet defying every eye that tried to measure their worth. The ballroom quieted. Laughter faded into silence. Even Howard lowered his drink, his gaze fixed on the unlikely pair. Amara's loose dress swirled around her legs as she spun. Ethan's polished shoes squeaked against the marble. Their breaths grew quick, their steps more confident. They weren't dancing for applause. They weren't dancing for him. They were dancing because they refused not to. At the edge of the room, Samuel's throat tightened. Pride burned through the fear in his chest. He pressed a hand over his mouth, eyes glistening. His granddaughter wasn't breaking. She was rising. Finally, as the melody crackled toward its end, Amara and Ethan slowed, then stilled. Their hands remained clasped, their faces flushed, their chests heaving. The ballroom was silent, the kind of silence that throbbed with something unspoken. Amara turned toward Howard. Her voice, soft yet unwavering, shattered the silence. "Well, do you keep your word only when it's easy?" The words struck like a blow. Howard blinked, as though waking from a strange dream. His jaw tightened. He set down his glass with a sharp click, his eyes unreadable. No one in that room could deny what they had seen. The challenge had been given, and the challenge had been met. And for the first time in years, Howard Kensington, the man who ruled boardrooms and bent senators to his will, found himself at a loss for words before a little girl who refused to bow. The silence after Amara's words stretched like a taut string. Howard Kensington's glass hovered just above the table, his eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a hard line. He was not used to being challenged, least of all by a barefoot child who had just twisted his cruel game into her own victory. Then, slowly, he set the glass down. The sound of crystal against wood echoed through the ballroom like a verdict. He leaned back, folding his arms, his gaze pinned on Amara. "So you danced," he said at last, his voice low. "But you think that changes who you are?" Amara's small shoulders lifted. Her hand remained tightly clasped with Ethan's. Her voice was clear. "It changes what you see." Gasps fluttered through the guests again. Howard's stare sharpened, but before he could retort, Ethan stepped forward, chin raised. "She didn't dance alone," he said, his voice louder this time, strong enough to carry to the back of the hall. "I danced with her, and I'd do it again." The room erupted in whispers. A senator's son, speaking so boldly in defiance of Howard, in front of his own mother. That was a scandal in itself. Senator Walker's wife shot to her feet. "Ethan, enough," she snapped, her voice slicing the air. "You're embarrassing your family." But Ethan didn't look at her. He only squeezed Amara's hand. "She deserves more than mockery. She deserves respect." Howard's lips curved into a tight, humorless smile. "Respect, earned by clumsy steps on my floor?" His eyes glinted with disdain. "Boy, you'll learn soon enough that respect is bought, not begged." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "Then maybe you've forgotten what it really means." The words struck a chord. Guests shifted uneasily. Some avoided Howard's stare, but others allowed the faintest nods of approval. For all his power, for all his wealth, Howard Kensington was being challenged by a child, and now, by two. Amara's grandfather, Samuel, stood at the edge of the ballroom, his chest aching with both fear and pride. He could hardly recognize his granddaughter in this moment, not because she seemed different, but because she seemed finally seen. She wasn't the girl scrubbing floors or the girl mocked for her dusty feet. She was the girl standing on marble, daring to answer back. Howard rose to his feet, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the dance floor. The chatter stilled instantly. He studied Amara for a long, unbroken moment. Then he turned to his assistant, a young man in a black suit, who had been standing silently near the wall all along. "Bring them to my study," Howard ordered. The words chilled the air. It was not surrender, nor was it anger. It was something deeper, harder to read. Samuel's heart hammered. He pushed through the crowd until he reached Amara. He stepped in front of her, his arm outstretched protectively. "If she goes, I go too," he said firmly. The assistant's face remained impassive, but he gave a small nod. "As you wish, together, Samuel, Amara." And Ethan followed as the assistant guided them through a side corridor. The laughter and chatter of the ballroom faded behind them, replaced by the muffled thud of footsteps against carpet. The air grew colder, heavier. The grandeur of the Kensington estate pressed in around them, gilded frames of ancestors, staring down with lifeless eyes, velvet drapes suffocating the hallways. Finally, they entered the study. The room was darker, cloaked in heavy mahogany. Bookshelves loomed like silent judges, filled with volumes no one had touched in years. The smell of old cigars clung to the air. A fire crackled faintly in the hearth, but the warmth did nothing to ease the tension. Howard entered last, closing the door behind him with deliberate finality. He walked slowly to his desk, each step echoing. Then he turned, his hands resting on the polished wood, and looked at Amara as though he were weighing her soul. "You think you've proven something," he said, his tone cold but oddly measured. "But what have you proven, really? That you're stubborn? That you can play to an audience?" He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "This house doesn't bend for weeds. If you come here, you live by my rules." Amara's fingers tightened around her grandfather's sleeve. Her voice was small, but steady. "I don't need you to bend. I just need you to keep your word." Samuel's breath caught. He looked down at her, torn between fear and awe. Howard studied her for a long, silent moment. The firelight danced across his face, deepening the lines of age and arrogance. At last, he exhaled, a sound that was almost a growl. "Very well," he said. "Welcome to Kensington Estate." The words were spoken not like an embrace, but like a treaty. Amara's heart pounded. She reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand in his. It was not the grasp of a child clinging to an adult. It was the grip of someone signing a pact, fragile, uneasy, but binding. Samuel's throat tightened. For years, he had prayed for safety, for opportunity, for something better for his granddaughter. Now, standing in this cold, cavernous study, he realized prayers sometimes came in forms you couldn't trust. Ethan, still at her side, whispered, "You don't have to do this." But Amara looked up at Howard, her voice low, her words for herself as much as for him. "I'm not afraid of your rules. I'll show you I belong." Howard's gaze flickered, just briefly. Something in the child's tone unsettled him, though he would never admit it. He straightened, releasing her hand. "Don't confuse kindness for commitment," he warned. "This isn't a fairy tale. This is survival." But even as he spoke, he knew he had already lost something, the certainty that had always been his armor. Amara had cracked it, if only slightly, and in that dimly lit study, among shadows and cigar smoke, the first sparks of an unexpected war and an unexpected bond began to burn. The fire in Howard Kensington's study hissed softly, the only sound in the cavernous room. Shadows stretched across the mahogany shelves stacked with dusty tomes. The air reeked faintly of cigars and old brandy, the scent of power hoarded too long. Howard leaned back against his desk, eyes cold as stone. Amara stood small and barefoot in the center of the room, her radio clutched to her chest like a shield. Samuel hovered just behind her, one protective hand on her shoulder, while Ethan lingered near the doorway, torn between fear and defiance. Howard finally broke the silence. "If you think tonight proves anything," he said slowly, "you're mistaken. Dancing doesn't change blood. It doesn't change where you come from. It doesn't erase the dirt clinging to your name." Amara's fingers tightened around the cracked handle of the radio. Her voice trembled, but she forced each word out, clear and steady. "It wasn't about the dance. It was about keeping your word. You promised." Samuel's heart twisted. He wanted to pull her close, to beg her to stop speaking before this dangerous man's pride turned into rage. But something in her gaze kept him frozen. His granddaughter wasn't begging. She was confronting. Howard exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're bold, I'll grant you that. Bolder than most grown men I know. But this house," he gestured around the study, to the fire, the shelves, the portraits glaring from gilded frames. "This house doesn't bend to weeds. If you want a place here, you'll live by my rules. My rules alone." Amara swallowed. Then she lifted her chin. "I don't need you to bend. I just need you to keep your promise. I'll prove myself." The fire cracked loudly, as though punctuating her words. For a long moment, Howard stared at her, the ice in his gaze flickering. Then, with a deliberate motion, he extended his hand. "Very well, welcome to Kensington Estate." The words were heavy, almost reluctant. Not the embrace of family, but the sealing of a contract. Amara hesitated. Then she stepped forward and placed her small hand in his. The grip was firm, not like a child's grasp, but like a pact between two adversaries forced to acknowledge one another. Samuel's chest ached. He wanted to shout, to drag her away, but something held him. This was Amara's choice, and in that choice he saw not fear but a flicker of destiny. Howard released her hand. He gestured to the assistant standing silently by the door. "Prepare a room for her," he ordered. Then, turning back, his voice hardened. "Don't mistake this for kindness. You're here because you interest me. But interest fades. You'll either rise to the standard of this house, or you'll break under it. Amara met his stare, her voice small but fierce. I won't break. Howard's eyes narrowed, unsettled by the certainty in her tone. He straightened, his towering frame once again cloaked in authority. See that you don't, he said curtly. Then he turned to Samuel. She may stay. You, however, have no place here. A gardener's hands don't belong in these halls. Samuel's fists clenched, but before he could speak, Amara tugged his sleeve. If I stay, he stays. We're a family. You can't separate us. The billionaire's jaw tightened. No one spoke to him this way, not senators, not CEOs, and certainly not children. But there was something in her gaze, something unyielding. He glanced at Ethan, who was still watching silently, his young face brimming with defiance. For the briefest second, Howard's composure faltered. At last, he gave a short, reluctant nod. Fine, but understand this: you will not undermine my authority in this house. His voice dropped to a growl. Not you, old man, not her, not anyone. Samuel's shoulders eased slightly. He squeezed Amara's shoulder, his voice a whisper only she could hear. You've done it, child. But it's only the beginning. Howard gestured dismissively, turning his back to them as though already bored. Go, rest. Tomorrow, the real test begins. The assistant led them out of the study. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud that felt less like welcome and more like a cell door closing. That night, Amara lay in a bed softer than any she had ever known. Silken sheets cocooned her small frame, but sleep refused to come. Moonlight spilled across the room, painting the ceiling in silver. She stared at the shadows, hearing Howard's words over and over. This isn't kindness. This is survival. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket. In her chest, fear battled with something fiercer. Determination. She whispered to herself, as though making a vow. I don't want his pity. I'll show them all why I belong here. Samuel, in a smaller guest room across the hall, sat by the window staring into the estate's sprawling gardens. His hands, scarred from years of labor, rested on the windowsill. He thought of his daughter, Amara's mother, gone too soon. He thought of the generations who had bent their backs for men like Howard Kensington. His heart ached with dread. Yet, beneath the fear, pride flickered. His granddaughter had faced the lion in his own den and survived. Downstairs, in the darkened study, Howard remained awake. He poured another glass of scotch, staring into the fire. His reflection wavered in the amber liquid. For years, his wealth had insulated him from doubt. But tonight, a child had cracked something inside him. He muttered to himself, almost unwillingly, weeds grow where roses die. The phrase lingered, unsettling him more than he cared to admit. The following morning, the estate buzzed with whispers. Servants eyed the new rivals with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Some scoffed openly, charity case. Won't last a week. Others shook their heads, murmuring, Mr. Kensington has lost his mind. Amara ignored them. She walked the hallways with her grandfather by her side, each step echoing against marble floors polished to blinding perfection. When they passed the portraits of Kensington ancestors, men with cold eyes and thin lips, she felt their stares pressing down on her. But instead of shrinking, she lifted her chin higher. By the time she entered the library for her first lesson with Miss Valerie, the stern tutor hired to refine her, Amara's vow burned hotter than ever. Howard Kensington thought she would break, but Amara Johnson had no intention of breaking. She intended to grow. Morning sunlight poured through the high-arched windows of Kensington Estate, gilding the marble floors and velvet drapes in pale gold. The house, vast and intimidating, hummed with the quiet rhythms of wealth, silver trays clinking, servants whispering in the halls, the soft shuffle of polished shoes across imported rugs. For Amara, it was another world entirely. The bed she had slept in the night before was softer than any she'd ever known. The ceiling soared above her like a cathedral. Yet when she sat at the breakfast table, with gleaming silver cutlery and porcelain plates, she felt the weight of stares more than the luxury. The staff served her food, but not with kindness. Their smiles were tight, their eyes sharp with judgment. She heard their whispers as they cleared dishes, believing she could not. She doesn't belong here. A gardener's granddaughter at the Kensington table, what a joke. Mr. Kensington's charity case won't last a month. Amara sat straighter, forcing herself to chew each bite slowly. Samuel sat beside her, his hand brushing hers under the table. A silent reminder, hold your head high. Don't let them see you break. Howard entered late, as always. He strode to the head of the table, his presence enough to silence the entire room. He glanced at Amara only once, as if to remind her, you are here on my terms, not yours. After breakfast, Amara was introduced to Miss Valerie, the tutor Howard had chosen. Valerie was tall, with a rigid posture and a bun pulled so tight it looked painful. Her eyes scanned Amara the way a jeweler inspects a flawed stone. Posture, Valerie said sharply. Back straight, shoulders down, chin up. Amara obeyed, though her muscles ached from the effort. We will begin with speech. Valerie continued. You will learn to stand like a lady, speak like a lady, and more importantly think like one, hour after hour. Amara recited grammar drills, copied lines onto paper until her wrist cramped, and practiced curtsies until her knees wobbled. Valerie corrected every syllable, every gesture, every breath that by the time Samuel came to fetch her. Amara's eyes stung with exhaustion, but when he asked gently, Are you all right, child? She lifted her chin and said, I'll be better tomorrow. Despite the strain, Amara found pockets of freedom in the vast estate. Ethan often appeared, slipping away from his parents' watchful eyes. He found her once near the stables, holding the reins of a restless horse. You ride? He asked. Amara shook her head. Never had the chance. Ethan grinned mischievously. Then let's fix that. They rode bareback, without saddles or rules. Laughter echoing across the fields. For the first time since arriving, Amara felt the wind in her hair and the ground thundering beneath her feet. She wasn't a project, or a pawn, or a burden. She was just a girl, free and alive. At the crest of a grassy hill, they stopped, panting with exhilaration. Ethan turned to her, his face more serious. You're not what I expected, he admitted. What did you expect? She asked. Someone quiet, someone scared. Amara looked out over the rolling fields. I am scared. I just got good at hiding it. Ethan studied her for a moment, then said softly, You're going to change this place. She frowned. What do you mean? I don't know. But when you danced last night, everything shifted. Like you cracked something open. His words lingered in her mind long after they rode back to the estate. Days turned into weeks. Amara endured Valeri's strict lessons, the servants' disdain, and Howard's cold silences. But slowly, she began to master posture, diction, etiquette. She learned when to bow her head and when to lift it higher. And then came the night of her first real test. Howard hosted a charity banquet in the Great Hall. Politicians, business moguls, and socialites filled the room, glasses of champagne in hand, voices rising above the string quartet. Amara stood at the edge of the hall, trembling in a pale yellow dress Claire Howard's confidant had chosen for her. She could feel the guests' eyes sliding over her, some with curiosity, others with disdain. When Howard tapped his glass, the room hushed. He gestured for Amara to step forward. Her heart hammered. She could hear Samuel's voice in her mind. Stand tall. Speak true. She took a breath, then walked to the center of the hall. The murmurs followed her like shadows. My name is Amara Johnson, she began, her voice shaking only slightly. I know what many of you are thinking, that I don't belong here. And maybe in your world, I don't. But I'm not here to be your exception. I'm here to be the beginning. The words struck like lightning. Silence fell so heavy it pressed against her chest. Faces blinked in shock. A senator's wife dabbed at her eyes. A businessman lowered his glass, stunned. From the back of the room, Samuel's eyes filled with tears. And then it began. Applause, at first hesitant, then swelling, until the hall reverberated with it. Howard's lips pressed together. But for once, he didn't hide the faint flicker of pride in his eyes. Amara bowed her head slightly, then stepped back. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time, the walls of Kensington Estate felt less like a cage and more like a battlefield she could win. But victories breed enemies. That night, whispers spread faster than the applause had. Servants murmured about the girl with too much mouth. Guests whispered over linen napkins, charity case or politician's pet. She speaks too well for where she came from. Amara heard enough to know acceptance would never come easy. Still, as she stood by her bedroom window, moonlight pooling across the floor, she whispered to herself, "I'm not here to be accepted. I'm here to change everything." And in the silence of the estate, the vow rang louder than any applause. The applause from Amara's speech still echoed in her memory days later, but so did the whispers. What had begun as murmurs turned into louder doubts. By the end of the week, she could feel it in every hallway she walked through, the shift in the air. Like a storm waiting to break. It began with the newspapers. A local columnist wrote about the barefoot girl who dared to speak in front of billionaires, calling her a symbol of resilience. Community centers requested her presence. Schools invited her to speak. The story spread, carried from small-town newsletters to bigger platforms. But praise always invited poison. At one breakfast, Claire, Howard's confidant, entered with anxious eyes. She dropped a newspaper onto the polished table. The headline screamed, "Kensington's charity case named in leaked will." Amara froze. Samuel's fork clattered against his plate. Howard's expression hardened into stone. The article detailed whispers that Howard's draft will mention Amara, sparking outrage among donors and shareholders. If true, it would mean a black child from poverty could one day inherit part of the Kensington fortune. The estate trembled under the weight of gossip. Servants' polite smiles turned brittle. Guests at luncheons lowered their voices when she entered. Samuel noticed doors closing quicker, conversations halting abruptly. And then the sabotage began. One morning, Amara and Samuel entered the greenhouse, the place he loved most, to find destruction. Pots overturned, seedlings crushed, the soil scattered like ash. Everything Samuel had tended was ruined. Tears welled in Amara's eyes. "They destroyed it," she whispered. Samuel's jaw clenched. His hands trembled as he knelt, lifting a broken stem. "This was deliberate," he said bitterly. "Ethan found them there," his face pale with anger. "My father says some donors are nervous. They think you're becoming divisible," he told Amara quietly. "Divisible?" She repeated, her voice cracking. "I'm a kid trying to help other kids." Ethan's eyes softened, but his voice carried the weight of a truth she wasn't ready to hear. Politics doesn't care about innocence. It only cares about control. Amara sat beside the wreckage, pressing her fingers into the soil. "I thought helping people was supposed to be the safe choice." Ethan crouched, lowering his voice. "They don't hate you, Amara. They fear what you represent." She looked at him sharply. "And what's that?" "That the future might not need them." The words pierced her like a spark through dry grass. The sabotage didn't stop her, it fueled her. At her next public address, standing before a hall of business leaders and politicians, Amara lifted her chin. Her voice rang steady. "I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the beginning." The crowd stilled. Some frowned, but others nodded, moved by the fire in her words. Even the mayor's wife wiped at her eyes. From the side of the room, Howard watched silently. When a donor asked aloud, "Who's advising her?" Howard answered with surprising pride, "No one. She is advising us." The applause this time was not hesitant. It was thunderous, but applause did not erase enemies. Later that night, Samuel warned her as they walked back through the darkened halls. "Child, the brighter you shine, the darker the shadows grow. Remember that." Amara clenched her fists. "Let them come. If they're afraid, then I must be doing something right." The storm broke days later. A man in a sharp suit, a stranger with a smile that cut like glass, appeared at the back of one of her gatherings. He said nothing, only watched. But when she met his eyes, Amara felt the chill of danger. That same week, the greenhouse was attacked again. This time, the sapling she and Ethan had planted together was nearly uprooted. Samuel managed to replant it, his hands shaking with fury. Amara touched the fragile roots with trembling fingers. "They want to scare us," she whispered. "They want to stop us." Samuel's eyes met hers, weary but proud. "Then don't give them what they want." That night, Ethan found her by the greenhouse. Rain pattered against the glass, dripping like tears down the panes. "You're not here to fight fire with fire," he told her gently. "You're here to plant something that outlives the flames." Amara turned her gaze toward the soil, remembering the sapling struggling against the storm. She thought of her mother's voice, of Samuel's tired hands, of every child she wanted to protect. Her jaw tightened. Then I'll plant louder. Loud enough they can't ignore it. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then said softly, "Sometimes your fire burns too hot. It scares people." Amara's eyes flashed. Good, it should. For the first time, Ethan didn't smile. He only looked at her, seeing the transformation. "You're not a child anymore," he whispered. "I don't think I ever was," she replied. The next morning, a butler delivered a manila envelope to Howard during breakfast. He opened it, scanned the contents, and stiffened. "What is it?" Amara asked cautiously. Howard folded the paper, his face unreadable. "There's going to be an audit. Someone filed a complaint." Her chest tightened. "Because of me." Howard met her eyes. For once, his voice softened. "Not because of you. Because of what you threatened to change." Later, she approached him in his study, hands trembling but voice firm. "I can't stop them from attacking me, but I can answer them. Let me write it my way." Howard studied her, then gave a single nod. "Very well, right." As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Remember, legacy isn't just what we leave behind. It's who's willing to carry it forward." She paused at the door, her throat tight, then whispered, "Then let me carry it." That night, Amara sat at her desk, the lamp casting golden light across paper. She dipped her pen, her small hand steady as she began to write. "We inherit both pain and power, and I plan to use the second to heal the first." It would be her first op-ed, her first public claim to not just survival, but leadership. And as the storm rattled against the windows, Amara Johnson, once a barefoot girl mocked in a ballroom, began to carve her words into history. Snow blanketed the Kensington estate, transforming its sprawling gardens into a white cathedral of silence. The trees bowed under frost, and the air smelled of pine and cold iron. Inside the mansion, tension pulsed like a restless heartbeat. Investors grumbled, donors hesitated, and servants whispered behind closed doors. But Amara moved through the halls differently now. No longer the trembling girl clutching a broken radio, she carried herself with purpose. Each step was deliberate, as though she was laying down roots with her very presence. Her op-ed had spread further than anyone expected. Community leaders quoted her. Teachers used her words in classrooms. On social media, hashtags carried her voice beyond the estate's iron gates. To some, she was a beacon. To others, she was a threat. One morning, Ethan found her by the greenhouse. The glass panes glittered with frost, and inside, the small sapling they had planted together struggled against the cold. Its roots had taken, but its leaves trembled. "Here," Ethan said, holding out a box tied with twine. Inside was a single root wrapped carefully in cloth. "From a tree my father planted years ago," he explained. "Samuel told me these survive anything. Plant it. Grow it." Amara pressed the root to her chest. Tears pricked her eyes. "Then we'll grow it together." They knelt in the frozen soil, their hands numb, pressing the root deep into the earth. To anyone watching, it was just two children planting in winter. But to Amara, it felt like planting a promise. Days later, the estate's gates opened to the public for the first time in decades. Howard, against the protests of his advisors, allowed Amara to host a community showcase. Neighbors, families, and children filed in, their footsteps crunching against the snow. They marveled at the mansion's grandeur, but more importantly, they gathered around the greenhouse where small green buds had begun to appear despite the frost. "This is the beginning," Amara told them, her voice steady as she stood before the crowd. "Not just for me, but for all of us. Roots grow deeper when they're shared." Her words carried across the gathering, and people nodded, not with polite applause, but with genuine belief. Howard stood at a distance, watching silently. His pride was buried under layers of skepticism, but he could not deny what he saw. The estate, once a fortress of isolation, was now alive with voices it had never welcomed before. Spring came quietly. The frost retreated, and the saplings pushed new buds into the warming air. Amara's Elise initiative began to bloom. Mobile classrooms traveling to poor neighborhoods, workshops for children, partnerships with local schools. She worked tirelessly, balancing her studies with speeches, planting sessions, and planning. Samuel often found her awake at dawn, arranging seeds or scribbling notes for her next address. "You promised roots, not just ideas," he reminded her gently. And she smiled. Then I'll plant both. At her next speech, she stood before teachers, parents, investors, and students. Behind her, banners read, Elise Initiative, Roots for the Future. Her voice was steady, her eyes bright. We weren't planted for survival alone. We were planted for growth. And together, we will grow louder than the storms meant to silence us. The room erupted in applause, real, resounding, unstoppable. Not everyone applauded. Enemies still lingered in shadows. A quiet investigation into Howard's finances loomed. Some donors pulled back, afraid of controversy. But Amara pressed forward. She wrote, she spoke, she planted. She carried flyers through the estate halls herself. She kneeled in the dirt with local school children, teaching them how to press seeds into soil. Mud clung to her dress, but her laughter rang louder than criticism. Leadership isn't perfection. She told Ethan one evening as they watched children splash in puddles near the greenhouse. It's persistence. You're growing, he said softly. She looked at him, then at the sapling that now stood taller than her waist. Its leaves shimmered in the evening sun. We're growing, she corrected. By summer, the estate had transformed. Once silent halls now echoed with the footsteps of children. Workshops bustled, mobile classrooms reached towns that had never known such resources. And the Elise Initiative drew national attention. Reporters no longer called her a charity case. They called her a leader. But Amara never forgot the weight of her beginnings, the barefoot steps on cold marble, the humiliation that birthed her defiance. One night, she stood by the greenhouse, the golden light of dusk spilling over the leaves. She tied a ribbon of summer gold around a branch of the sapling, whispering, "We're still growing." Samuel approached quietly, hands in his coat pockets. He studied her for a long moment before saying, "Your mother would be proud." Amara blinked back tears. "Do you ever think I made the wrong choice?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "No, I think you've reminded us why choices matter at all." Autumn arrived, and with it came recognition. Schools requested her leadership. Communities sought her guidance. The Elise Initiative gained grants and partnerships. But Amara kept her eyes on the soil, on the roots. She knew change was fragile. Like saplings in wind. Howard remained distant, yet present. He watched her speeches, read her articles, and sometimes, though never admitting it, nodded with quiet approval. One evening, as she tied another ribbon to the sapling, he approached silently. "You did that," he said. Amara glanced at him, her voice soft but firm. "We did." He studied her. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something quieter. "Your roots are taking hold, and so is your legacy." For once, Amara allowed herself to smile. Not in triumph, but in recognition of a battle still unfinished, yet already reshaping the ground beneath them. Years later, people would remember that night in the ballroom, the barefoot girl who defied a billionaire and danced with courage instead of grace. But for Amara, her legacy was not in that moment of humiliation turned victory. It was in the children's laughter echoing across once sterile halls, in the seeds pressed into soil by muddy hands, in the sapling that now stretched skyward, vibrant and unshakable. Justice, she realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it grows quietly, deeply, like roots beneath the soil. And in the end, the greatest legacy is not in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we plant for others to inherit. Amara placed her hand on the trunk of the sapling, now nearly as tall as she was. She whispered to it, to herself, to the generations yet to come, "We made it, and this is only the beginning."